As we move into discussion, let me ask you, please, when I call upon you, to give us your name, your institutional affiliation, if you have one, and to whom you want to address your question. Tom Christensen? Wait for the mic, Tom.
Oh, I had a question for Justin. It was an excellent presentation. Could you would it be an oversimplification to say that since there's this nexus between the infrastructure and the smuggling and the opportunities for terrorists, that if you reduce tariffs, you could fight terrorism? Because it obviously, if it's an economic benefit to the local populations, because they can't get the goods at such a cheap price because they're paying taxes to import them legitimately.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think sort of decreasing tariffs on a lot of goods would go a long way towards increasing our ability to fight terrorism, with two caveats. First, I mean, the main reason the Indonesian government doesn't decrease tariffs is because they're relatively easy to collect compared to other kinds of taxes, right? And they don't have the infrastructure right now to actually collect income taxes in a major way. And the second issue is that some of the goods that are smuggled are not technically illegal, but can be obtained more cheaply even without tariffs, right? TVs, for example, are usually just stolen from Malaysia and Singapore and sold in Batam, right? It's below market rate, right? But it's true. I mean, I agree. I think that tariffs actually are sort of weirdly, because of this analysis, one of the best ways to fight terrorist logistics, actually. Right.
Yes, sir. Second question? Gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Saurabh Gupta from Samuels International Associates. Question is for Mr. Valencia. You talked about conducting military exercise. It might be a danger conducting military exercise if people, maybe among the big powers, were to do so in a disputed EEZ. Has there been any military exercises conducted in disputed EEZ by Japan, China, US, or India? And second question is with regard to the code of conduct, the ASEAN code of conduct with China. Which was the party which kind of eroded the consensus on that code of conduct? Is there any one party or both sides responsible for the erosion of that?
Yes. Okay, I was talking about foreign military exercises within someone else's EEZ, a recognized EEZ. The boundary doesn't have to be disputed. That could, of course, exacerbate the problem. But yes, there's a well-known case, last year, there was a proposal at the ARF that the U.S., the Philippines, and somebody else undertake military exercises in the Malaysian EEZ. And it may have been behind the scenes, but Malaysia was furious and virtually threatened to pull out of the whole arrangement because it violated. She has a national law that says that you cannot undertake such exercises in their EEZ without her consent. There's about 17 countries around the world. Brazil is another, for example, that have this. The U.S. says that you can't bar these activities. Well, but again, this has to do with the treaty and with obligations under the treaty. It's controversial. Regarding the declaration, well, I think all parties have cheated, as it were, or hedged on the declaration. They have publicized areas for tourism. They have established weather stations. They've undertaken marine scientific activities that are considered provocative because they're not, they're doing it in areas claimed by others. So if there's been an erosion of the consensus, all parties are probably equally at fault, or at least partially at fault. But as Hashim Jalal often says, jaw is better than war, and that there hasn't been any direct conflict since the declaration. There's been strong attempts to try to formalize it into virtually a treaty. China has been resisting, and that's where the ball lies right now.
Sir in the back, and then June after that.
Hi, my name is Andy Wang with the Hudson Institute, and this question is also for Mr. Mark Valencia. You talk about the MMCA, the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, and so the two parts of my question is, how do you think we should strengthen that agreement? Since it's supposed to be a forum to facilitate conversation between the United States and China, has become a propaganda piece for the Chinese government, and should we formulate that along the lines of the U.S.-Soviet Incidents at Sea Agreement? And the second part of my question is, should we scrap the bilateral approach altogether and just focus on multilateral agreements such as the Western Pacific Naval Symposium? Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a good question. A good several questions. Well, the phenomena that I'm talking about is not going to be resolved, I doubt, through the MMCA. First of all, I didn't have time, but these issues have come up not just between the U.S. and China, between China and Japan, between India and Britain, between India and the U.S., various ways, so that it's a broader question. Secondly, we're not talking about rules of the road here. We're not talking about don't shine your spotlight on my bridge, don't buzz my vessel. We're talking about very sophisticated signals intelligence, which I said has become active rather than passive, and which is stirring up trouble. Now, an in-sea agreement would be a good first step, but it would not be. It would be necessary, but not sufficient. And that's where I come to these guidelines, which a group of us have written up, something like the San Remo Manual, when there was no agreed-on rules of the road, that countries might look at to consider. It doesn't mean that they have to abide by them. It just means that if they don't, they understand, and the intent is clear that they're not being particularly, shall we say, friendly or neighborly. What should we do unilaterally or multilaterally? Well, the U.S. has particular problems with China, but as I say, these problems are spreading. And we've seen the high points because in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, because China is resisting. But as I said, that's the tip of the iceberg. Many countries are not particularly happy with the activities of the maritime powers within their EEZs, and that the time, I think, for guidelines is approaching.
June?
June Teufel-Dreyer, University of Miami. I have a question for James. You mentioned that the Japanese wanted joint development and the Chinese wanted cooperative development. Could you distinguish for me what each side understands by those, please?
Okay. I may have actually gotten it backwards in my presentation. As I understand it, the joint development phrase refers to the area, to developing resources in the joint development zone, okay, the 2,700 square kilometer area. Cooperative development refers to, in the Chinese calculation, the participation of Japanese entities at the Chunshou gas field. Okay, and the difference is that there's nothing joint about that, right? The Chunshou gas field is a Chinese gas field. The Japanese call it Shirakawa, but the Japanese do not claim sovereignty, if you can claim sovereignty over a gas field, which of course you can't. But they use Shirakawa, the media started using Shirakawa to reinforce the Japanese argument that they were entitled to something there, right? The concern was that it went under the median line, and they were entitled to a share of that. That's what the Japanese media started doing. I don't refer to it as Shirakawa in anything I write because it's a Chinese field. That is undisputedly true. And under the agreement, the cooperative development is negotiating Japanese access to a Chinese field. And the agreement clearly says under Chinese rules and domestic laws, and there are rules about participation of foreign companies. Now, I suspect that is just political wrangling because they both know what the agreement says. I mean, Reinhard Drift has translated them, and they're the two versions. They're, as I understand it, very similar. This is just political wrangling to avoid actually having to start take this forward, at least in the Chinese calculation.
Tom, is it related to this?
Yeah, go ahead,
Okay.
Tom.
I heard an interpretation that said that since Chunxiao is inside the 200 nautical mile EEZ of Japan,
Yes.
that until China recognizes the median line, Chunxiao is in disputed territory and could be considered Japanese. So it's a kind of jujitsu
It is.
against the Chinese position, which is take the median line and take Chunxiao, or push for 200 nautical miles and give us Chunxiao potentially because it's within our 200 nautical miles. And you can't have it both ways. And that's a Japanese position that has been asserted in the past.
It has been asserted in the past, and I think from an international legal standpoint, it hasn't been consistently interpreted in the past. Right? The median line predate like that. The median line was where Japan was the limit of Japan's EEZ claim in their EEZ law. Right? They started to claim 200 nautical miles after the fact because of the discovery of Chunxiao. Right? So their 200 nautical mile claim is completely related to the discovery at Chunxiao, and the Chinese view that as being opportunistic. Jia Daozhong wrote a really good piece in Beijing Review about it. I'm not an international lawyer, but whether or not you can go ahead and change your maritime claim, because the median line goes back to 1977. Japan's been having this line, right? So that reverses, 30 years of Japanese maritime claim. They do. I mean, it's true. It's true. I mean, they would argue that, but I mean, it's certainly not going to move anything forward, right? But yeah, no, I take the point. But I just want to emphasize that the Japanese 200 nautical mile claim came after resources were discovered at Chunxiao, which is why the Chinese sort of view it as being dishonest. Yes.
Yes, sir. You yes.
Hi, my name's Tom Popinski. I'm from Cornell. My question is for Justin. Justin, that was a fascinating presentation. My question is more on the boundaryness of the problem of piracy and terrorism. I don't quite yet understand why these should be more likely to go together near a boundary versus otherwise. It seems to me that a terrorist would have an incentive to... The photographer's in my way. I can't look at you. It would seem to me that that a terrorist network would have the same incentives to use smuggling networks that don't cross boundaries as they would to use ones that do cross boundaries. We know that terrorists must smuggle weapons and such through internal borders as well. And so I'm struck by the fact that you are right, that they do seem to go together at borders. But what is it about borders that changes the calculations of terrorists?
By and large, it's the fact that sort of states have an incentive to put as much of their coercive apparatus at the borders as possible, right? And so as a result, it increases the cost of crossing a border relative to moving around inside of a country, right? So, sort of in Jamal Islamia's case, the way they smuggle weapons from the Philippines is actually because they had a fishing boat that they had bought through an associate who would actually then move them secretly across the border. Once they were inside of Indonesia, they didn't have a regular courier service move them to Jakarta, right? So, I mean, it's from their perspective, it's a lot easier to move inside of a country than at the border. And because of that, you actually almost need to put a support structure at the border to facilitate that movement.
Yes, sir. Didn't you have? Yeah, good.
Bud Cole, National War College. Question for Dr. Manicum. I have in your description of the problems that the Chinese are having trying to reorganize their Coast Guard or organize the Coast Guard are certainly right on the money. I've also heard and seen indications that the PLAN is attempting to exert greater influence within the Coast Guard type organizations, especially the FLEC. I wondered if you had seen any indications of that.
I think you probably know more than I would with that, but I don't know anything specifically. I mean, I do know that the FLEC, as far as I understand it, use old PLA Navy vessels, right? They use the old Jiangsu or whatever they are, the frigates. And I have heard that they will train with the PLA, and when they're deployed in the South China Sea, there's PLA around. But I haven't heard anything to suggest that they're, that there's a great deal of linkage. But I mean, I think Lyle Goldstein's the guy to ask about that. He would probably know. Thanks.
Anne-Marie?
Anne-Marie Murphy, Seton Hall University. My question's for Justin. Justin, like Tom, and I'm sure many in the room, I found your presentation fascinating. I was wondering, though, if you could talk a bit about why you think acts of piracy have declined, right? I mean, if we look back to, 2001, 2002, the Malacca Strait was one of the most pirated straits in the world. Lloyd's of London forced ships to have extra insurance. And we've seen a dramatic decline in piracy. In my conversations with the Indonesians, they will say, as your analysis has suggested, that piracy is a problem that begins on land. That's one of the reasons they've opposed a lot of U.S. proposals for joint patrols in the straits. And my interlocutors will tell me that they have embarked on a very strong police program on the borders, and that's one of the reasons we've seen the decline in piracy. So I guess I'd just like you to comment on that, what you might, if you agree with that, if you don't, and what you might hope to see going forward. Thank you.
So in terms of why piracy has declined, I mean, it hasn't disappeared entirely, but it certainly has declined. I think there are sort of a couple of reasons. I mean, one of the issues with the Lloyd's of London sort of conclusions was they actually weren't really correlated with the numbers in the Malacca Straits at that time. They were already declining before Lloyd's of London declared the Malacca Straits a war zone, right? And so I think there are a couple of issues. I mean, the first is that you're right. I mean, Indonesia has started taking policing on land much more seriously, right? One of the issues of the decline in hijackings is that since about 2004, there have been a series of measures on the international level to make ships just harder to sell, right? I mean, now that, sort of now larger ships have these identifications. It's very difficult to hide. You can't really, there's an increase in awareness, so you can't really just sell a ship without anyone asking questions anymore. The result is that when ships have been hijacked now, they actually scuttle the ship and just take the cargo, right? And so, I mean, those two things combined probably have done a lot to decrease piracy, right? One of the things I don't think has helped all that much, except for a mild deterrent effect, is the patrols themselves, right? If you sort of look at how often the Indonesians have patrolled, I mean, sort of talking to people I've talked to, they're like, well, we do it once every 3 months and like hope they don't notice that we're not actually there, right? And I mean, so in that sense, going after pirates and capturing them on land, or immediately going after pirates right after they stage an attack, which is what they've started doing the past 5 years, has been very helpful in deterring pirates in the long term from actually carrying out their attacks.
If I could just interject one point along the same line, to a certain extent, the piracy has been relocated. If you go further up into the South China Sea, there's still a fair amount, but it has gone away from the Straits of Malacca. Further questions? Well, amazing. We may conclude 5 minutes early. If not, please join me in thanking all of the panelists for excellent presentations.